Welcome back to the Mindful Hunter podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jay Nichol. And this is either going to be the podcast episode that you've been waiting for, or it's going to be the one that you want to skip. I am going to get into my backstory, who I am, where I came from, how I ended up where I am today, and specifically how I'm almost 15 years sober at this point. Now, before we dive into this story, I think it makes sense to give a little bit of context around why I think this story should even be told, or more specifically, why I think it might be useful for the people who listen to this podcast. So a lot of what I talk about has to do with mental fortitude, and a lot of things that I do require a great deal of mental fortitude. And sometimes I think I get a lot of questions from people, and I think they're comparing themselves to me in a way that might not be fair. Like they're like, I want to go do the things that you do. I don't feel comfortable doing those things. Or, you know, what is it about you that makes you able to do those things? And very little of what I'm good at in hunting has anything to do with hunting. So it has a lot more to do with kind of like my formative experiences. And that's kind of what gives me my determination and my grit and my ability to, you know, kind of withstand uncomfortable situations. And maybe most importantly, my discipline, because I was not always like this. In fact, I was the polar opposite of what I am today. I mean, I was always fairly driven. I always had a vision of what I wanted to do, but I was incapable of putting the pieces together to actually execute on that vision. And it wasn't until I went through my particular life experiences, kind of came out on the other side, went back into some shit, came back out again, that I really turned into the man that I am today, capable of the things that I am today. And so I think sharing some of those experiences and how they affected me might be beneficial for the people who listen to this. And it might also give you some context. I wouldn't recommend you take the path I took, but I think there are some overarching lessons that we can take away about the type of experiences you need to put yourself through in order to turn yourself into someone who can do things that, to be quite honest, most other people can't. Like that's always been, and I don't know, does that sound egotistical? It might sound arrogant, but that's always been something that's been very important to me from a young age. I wanted to do shit other people couldn't. Like that was a yardstick for me to judge somehow the level of my accomplishments. Like it wasn't good enough to just do what everybody else was doing. I wanted to be able to do things that other people weren't able to do or found particularly difficult. One of the biggest lessons I've learned in my life is that one of the best ways to create value is to find those things that you are particularly good at and that maybe you enjoy doing, but at the very least, you don't hate doing, that other people do hate doing and aren't very good at. Do you know what I mean? Like forestry engineering was like that for me. Most people did not want to spend 10 hours a day walking around in the pissing rain in the mountains of coastal British Columbia. I loved it. And so I excelled at it because I was happy to go to work every day when everybody else was bitching and moaning and complaining. So I got promoted quicker. I moved up the ladder quicker. I started making more money quicker. I started getting more responsibilities quicker. It wasn't that I was particularly smarter than anybody else or more hardworking. It was that it was naturally easier for me to do things that other people found really difficult. But that doesn't apply to everything. I've got my ass kicked in a variety of domains in life because they were things other people found easy that I found difficult. I learned a lot of lessons doing my MBA like that. Like there's some skills some of the men and women had in my class that I'm just like, I'm not even going to compete with these guys because they're so good at these particular things and they enjoy doing them so much that no matter how hard I try, I'm never going to be able to compete. You know, it's weird. One of the first rules of business is you never compete. People always think the trick to business is like, how do I win? The trick to winning is to not compete. You got to find a way to do something that no one else is doing. You want to create your own category as opposed to fight for market share in a pre-existing category. And I think when you look at the things that you spend time in your life doing, I have the same perspective. How can I create my own category? How can I do something amazingly well that other people aren't doing? Anyways, we're getting off on a tangent already, but that's a lot of what this podcast is going to be about. I think if I ever had a gift at anything, it's my ability to articulate the way that I think and feel and express how things impact me and how I process them and what I think about them on the other side. I think that's why the little segments at the end of my films, even though I swear, I always think people are going to, give me shit or hate them. They seem to be, one of the most popular parts of the hunting films. Anyways, I think I'm going to be honest with you right now. I'm fairly anxious, not in a wholly negative way, but in a somewhat negative way. I've tried to record this podcast a half a dozen times over the last 2 months. And I thought that things were just naturally occurring that kept delaying it. And it really hit me this morning when I was like puttering around the house, procrastinating, sitting down here and hitting record, that I'm about to talk about a lot of really uncomfortable things. And I'm about to share a lot of vulnerability wide open on the internet. And that creates a lot of anxiety because, as you can see from social media, people are not always the most kind, and people can use the things that you share about yourself against you. And if somebody wants to do that with some of the information in this podcast, have at her. I think you will learn by the end of this podcast, with the shit that I've been through in my life, I really don't care. And there's really nothing anyone can do to me at this point that I haven't already done to myself or been through another similar circumstance. So I'm going to be as open and honest and transparent with my story as I am capable of being, which is pretty drastically open and honest. Now, the other note that I want to make in that regard is that we're going to talk about some pretty touchy subjects. And some of you, based on your own history, your own past, some of the things that have happened to you, some of the things that you've done to other people, you might find this a really uncomfortable podcast to listen to. I'm not going to pull any punches. If this is the type of conversation that's, going to make you unduly uncomfortable, and that's not something you're interested in, then just don't listen. I would recommend, though, if you have some similar experiences and maybe you haven't dealt with them as thoroughly as you need to, I think talking about them and sharing about them in the long run is the best bet. All right. I believe that's enough of a preamble. Let's get into this story, who I am and where I came from. All right. So I'm 44 years old, as most of you know. So I was born into what I would consider, I guess, like a fairly typical middle-class family. I had 3 grandparents that were alive. Had a really big family on my mom's side, 8 brothers and sisters. My dad's side was much smaller, just 2 brothers, the 3 boys on that side. Both my grandparents on my father's side were alive when I was born. Only my grandma on my mom's side was alive when I was born. All 3 of them are dead now. And I was born in a fairly small town, Owen Sound, Ontario, maybe 20,000 people. And if anybody grew up in Southern Ontario, it's like it was a fairly typical Southern Ontario town. Like there was some, factory jobs. I think my parents met while they were working at Monroe, the shock factory. And it was like doing okay. That area of Ontario now is just like this like retirement mecca with like a dead economy. And it's not a particularly pleasant place or a great place to start a family, or it's a lot of those jobs have left for a variety of reasons. But back then it was like it was a pretty happening place, small town, good values, all the rest. Now, I think the one characteristic that like jumps out at me is that like alcoholism and drug abuse was rampant in my family from the day I was born. Far more alcoholism than drug abuse at that point. But like I can remember there's pictures of my toys as a kid, and there's like these proud Canadian Maple Leaf stickers on everything. And I'm pretty sure there were, if anybody back in the day, Royal Reserve, this like whiskey had these like rectangular maple leaf stickers on the back that if you peeled them off just right, you could stick them on other stuff. And I literally had those stickers all over my toys. There was a lot of partying when I was a young kid. My grandparents always had a lot of people over. I do have positive memories of that when I was younger. And remember, this is like the late 70s, early 80s. Like this is pretty standard behavior for people at those times. Lots of drunk driving. Big corn boils and all the rest of it. And so from the inside out, it appeared pretty normal to me. I think when I was about, and here's the other thing, I'm going to be brutally honest. I don't remember a whole lot of my childhood. I remember some of it, and I have little Polaroid snapshots in my mind here and there, but like real cohesive memories don't actually start until I'm maybe like 10 or 12 years old. And a lot of the stuff I'm about to get into will kind of explain, I think I just shut a lot of that stuff out. So I think I really started to notice that like things weren't right when I was maybe like between 4 and 6 or something like that. So that's when like the violence kind of started to happen. Now I was never beat as a child, so I don't want to say that like my old man was super violent, used to beat up my mom and all that kind of stuff. That's not true. There was some isolated incidents of violence. I can remember like big fights breaking out, but I don't know, that to me is more like party violence, like drinking violence. Like it's just people being assholes, getting drunk, throwing a couple shots. Yeah, maybe a guy hit a woman and a woman kicked another guy in the balls, but it wasn't like domestic abuse in the classical form. But, you know, I can remember having to get woken up in the middle of the night, staying at my grandparents' place and getting thrown in the back of a car because there was some big drunken brawl and my mom was pissed at my grandpa or whatever the case may be. I can remember seeing some of that violence, and then we'd drive, 3 hours back to wherever we actually lived. There's a lot of that stuff kind of going on. Now, my parents split when I was 6 years old, and they were both still drinking very heavily. My mom was probably worse off than my dad, and I lived with my mom. I have one brother. He's 3 years younger, and we both lived with my mom. And we used to go see my dad every third weekend, and we'd go spend a weekend with him. So pretty standard split parent stuff. Again, like pretty regular middle class upbringing. Now, some of the things that happened during this time that kind of like formed me and like created who I am. And again, I'm going to try and be as vulnerable as possible here because I think, some of the things that happened to me as a child have happened to a lot of other men. And men are afraid to talk about these things because they think it somehow violates their masculinity, or if they admit to it or discuss it openly, it makes them less of a man. I've had to do a shitload of counseling over my life, both from childhood shit, drunk parent shit, my own drug abuse shit. I feel like I've dealt with these issues enough that I'm open sharing about them. So I was molested 3 times by the time I was 12 years old by 3 different people. I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of the details because I don't think it really serves the story. I think it's a lot more commonplace, and I think that shit happened to a lot more of us, especially during that era, than a lot of people talk about. And the weird part is I didn't remember any of it. There was even like, there was cops at one of them, and like, they were like legitimate, like it was a big deal. And I blocked it all out. And it wasn't until years later when I was going through my own recovery and kind of going through my own counseling that like all that stuff kind of started coming back to me. Some of it when I was a little bit younger that I'll get ahead. So again, that's not a victim thing. That's not like a pity plea thing. It does need to be shared though, because I think those are the foundational experiences. When I start talking about why I made some of the choices later in my life and some of the ways that I behaved, I used to think that those were all personal responsibility. Like I decided to become a junkie because I wanted to get high. The older you get, the more work you do, the more you realize, you know, that shit that happens when we're kids, it fucks us up. And it impacts us in a way that we can't even realize or appreciate until years and decades down the line. So I share that so you can understand, you know, part of the stuff that happened to me. Now, that didn't mean my parents didn't look after me. I was always deeply loved. To this day, I have strong relationships with both my parents. It's a very loving family. I always say I love you every time I see either of them. Hugs and kisses with both my dad and my mom. Like I always knew I was loved, and I always knew people wanted to take care of me. But to be brutally honest, there was periods during my life, long periods, where people weren't capable of taking care of me, and a bunch of really fucked up shit happened. So the other thing that's going on in this period is that my mom sobers up when I'm 9 years old. So 6 to 9 is like pure chaos. Do you know what I mean? I remember literally nothing other than like those little snapshots. Now, when my mom sobers up, it's almost like in a way things get worse before they get better. There's probably a lot. So I'm the oldest child, and there's probably a lot of other oldest children that can relate to this. I had a far more parental role in my household than a child role. Like I'm the one who taught my brother how to read when I was very young. I would get my brother ready for school in the morning. I would make sure I walked him home. We were full-blown latchkey kids, like in the truest, like I think I was watching my brother alone at 9 or 10 years old because my mom had just got sobered up. She had to go get a job. She went to treatment for a while, so we had to live with my aunts and uncles. And so that kind of like overblown sense of responsibility, or that inappropriate sense of like you're not supposed to be doing those types of things or be responsible for those types of things when you're, 9, 10, 11, and 12 years old. And I, in hindsight, when I hit my teens and all the craziness happened, it was a backlash against that because I had felt it was unfair. I didn't get a childhood. I didn't get to, run around and play and do the other shit the other kids were doing. I had to take care of a family because the people who were supposed to take care of my family were incapable of doing it at that time. So anyways, mom gets sober when I'm 9. Life kind of starts to get back on track. At this point, we are dirt poor. We go from like lower middle class to like below the poverty line. No real support from my father. I think my mom maybe got like a couple $100 a month child support. And I remember, I've talked to my mother about this, the average yearly income, she was on mother's allowance, which is like a fancy word for welfare back in the day. And it was $12,000 a year. And that's, as a family of 3, that's what we lived on. That was everything. That was rent. That was food. That was clothes. Every single thing you can possibly, healthcare, dentist, like all of it was paid for with $12,000 in a month. I remember living in apartments with bare drywall, sleeping in the same bed as my brother. Like it was, we were poor as shit. And that's the funny thing now. Like sometimes I think people see what I have now and they think I come from this like background of money. And it's like, you'll see when we get into this story, like the reason I am so bold and I take such decisive action and I almost care so little about money these days is that I have had nothing so many times in my life that it doesn't scare me. If I lost everything I have today, I would just get it back again tomorrow because I've already done that a half a dozen times and it doesn't, I think that's almost a superpower. I think people who come from money are actually more prisoners of their money than people who don't, because the people who come from money don't understand. They're afraid of what it's like to be without money. I've had nothing and you're still fine. You live and you figure out a way to do it. You know, you grind and you crawl your way back up. So literally like from 9 to like 13 or 14 is like all kind of the same shit. My mom slowly gets her stuff together. We go visit my dad every now and then. And then basically when I'm 14, I have this big blowout with my father. I was smoking cigarettes already, and I think I was smoking weed, but I hadn't like gone off the deep end. And we were visiting him for a weekend, and I think my grandfather had seen me smoking something with some kids in town or something like that. Got back to our grandparents' place that night, and everybody's drunk as shit. And I get into this yelling match with my old man, and this is the only time that there was ever any violence between me and my old man. And I was starting to get to be a bigger kid. I'm bigger now than my old man is. At that time, he was still significantly larger than me. And we basically get into this punch up. And then my grandpa gets involved, who's bigger than both of us. And is like, to this day, like the meanest, scariest man I ever knew in my life. And some of the negative parts of myself, I respect my Grandpa Jack a lot, but he was a very, very, very hard man. And he has his own reasons for why he was the way he was. But in a lot of ways, I'm very much like him. Like I have this kind of like edge to my personality that my dad doesn't really have. And even physically, I don't look like my dad. I look like him in my face, but my body and like my height and my shoulder, like I look like my grandfather. And I remember I was up against the side of the wall. My old man had my head pinned in the corner of this brick wall outside. And he's punching me in the head, and my grandfather's punching my dad in the head. My dad's name's Lance. My grandfather's name is Jack, and Jack's yelling at my dad, "Lance, let the boy go." He's punching him. I'm punching him. He's punching me. Like it's just this, and everybody's kind of drunk, so it's not like people are getting the shit kicked out of them. It's like it's bad, but it's not crazy. Anyways, that kind of blows up. And I literally take off running in sock feet. And we were out in this kind of like rural area outside Owen Sound. And I end up running like, I don't know, maybe a couple of kilometers to this local convenience store. It was like midnight and there was a payphone. And I phoned my mom, who lived maybe like 40 minutes away. And I just stayed there at this convenience store until my mom showed up. So basically, my mom picks me up. We go back to my grandparents', pick up all my shit. There's this big blowout, and it really like kind of severs communication for a significant amount of time with that side of the family, and we take off. And so now to me, that's like chapter 1. It's like my youth or whatever. And then we hit my adolescence. And this is where, you know, really for myself, up until then, I'd been a straight A student. I'd never missed a day of school. I had this like, I was like pretty clean cut. Like when you look back at pictures, like buttoned up collared shirts and like nice haircuts, you know, once my mom started to get her stuff together, like I was pretty together as a kid. And then what happens is right around the beginning of grade 9. So at the end of grade 8, which is maybe like a year or two after this incident with my father, we decide I don't want to live with my mother anymore. And we kind of patch things up a little bit, and I'm going to go live with my dad. So I go live with my dad, and I only make it 6 months. He lives kind of near Toronto. And when I come back from Toronto, like that 6 month period, it was like everything just fell apart. I come back from Toronto, start hanging out with like the worst crowd you can think of, like kind of skating, kind of a stoner, kind of like a grunge kid, and basically start skipping school, start smoking weed on a daily basis, start doing, lots of other drugs. And then really, I think it was the winter of grade 9, things start to go downhill. So on what we used to do when we were kids is that we would go to, it wasn't Kmart and it wasn't Walmart. It was the other one, not Zellers. It's not even around anymore. Anyways, one of these big department stores. And we would go there and we would steal 4 CDs each. And they had the big long sleeves. Remember those big 18-inch hard plastic sleeves they would keep CDs in, so you could flick through them and then you couldn't steal them. But we would literally stuff 4 of those each in our jackets and we'd walk out of this department store and we'd go break the cases off and we'd go to the local pawn shop. And if we left the plastic on, he'd give us $6 a piece for CDs because he could sell them as new. And if the plastic was off, he'd give us $5 a piece. So we'd take the CDs down to this pawn shop. If we had 8 at $6 a piece, it would be $48. And at that time, that was enough to buy an eighth of weed and a pack of smokes. So you'd have 2 dudes, an eighth of weed and a pack of smokes. And that was a pretty good night. And you'd have a little bit left over the next morning. But this time we get downtown, we go to buy the eighth of weed and nobody's got weed. And it's a small town, so this shit happens sometimes. And my buddy, I was going to name him, but I won't just in case more people listen to this podcast than I think are gonna. He goes, listen, I can't get any weed, but I can get some heroin. And at this point, I had done a lot of drugs. I'd done mushrooms, I'd done acid, I'd smoked a ton of weed. I think that was the most of what I'd done. Some weird pills, but nothing crazy, but I'd never done heroin. And to put things in context, this is kind of at the boom of heroin chic. You know what I mean? This is a couple years before Pulp Fiction comes out. Nirvana was the biggest band on the planet. Kurt Cobain was an open junkie. Trainspotting had just come out. It was as a kid in the early 90s, heroin was everywhere. And it seemed kind of cool. Nowadays, living in Vancouver, when my kid sees East Hastings, that's what she thinks heroin was. That was not what I thought heroin was back in the day. So the first time I shoot heroin, I'm 15 years old. So we meet up with this guy, we give him our cash. It was $50 a point. And heroin is almost 1/10 the size of Coke. If you buy Coke in grams, you buy heroin in points. And it's been so long, they probably even fucking sell it differently now. But a point of heroin is nothing. When you're looking at it physically, it is very underwhelming. And I had done some Coke at this point. And so I knew kind of what powder size should be. And I'm looking at this and I'm this ain't going to do shit, man. And I had to split it with my buddy and we went up to this other guy's apartment. There was kind of these local junkies who lived in town. And we went up to their apartment and the one guy was shooting up in the corner. And literally 0 peer pressure, 0 anything. His name was Brent. And I looked at Brent and I was hey man, I want to do that. And my buddy was what are you talking about? And I'm dude, there's nothing here. This isn't even going to do anything. I'm I might as well shoot it. He's you're an idiot. So, and I remember this it was yesterday. I can remember the music that it was playing. It was 9 Inch Nails. I can remember what the dude's hair looked like. I can remember everything. So he cooks this heroin up, ties me off, he shoots it. And it was you think they kind of blow it out of proportion on those movies, and they don't. It was literally that sense of this. I'd never felt anything like it in my life. And it's this intense warmth kind of came in right at the back of my neck and it just spread throughout my entire body. And it sounds kind of cliche, but my whole life I had felt wrong. Do you know what I mean? My family was fucked up. I was fucked up. My life was fucked up. I never fit anywhere. I should also preface this. I moved 32 times by the time I was 18 years old. So when I'm 15, I've already moved 12, 13, 14 times. I never went to a school more than 1 year in my life. Constantly moving, constantly the new kid, constantly feeling out of place. And the moment that shit hit, man, it was all gone. I felt okay. And that was all that mattered. And everything disappeared. I didn't care about anything. Nothing seemed to matter. And it was like perfect. And I don't want to like glorify drugs too much, but like I end up going on and being a junkie for like at that point, the vast majority of the rest of my life. And I shot cocaine, I shot heroin, I shot anything you could fucking put in a syringe. The nice thing about heroin is that while the rush is not as intense as cocaine, it lasts way longer and the come down is way less. So those first few times when you do heroin, you get high, you're like rushed high for maybe like 10, 15 minutes, like kind of on the nod, like holy shit. And then you're just pleasantly buzzed for like an hour or two. You got kind of an itchy face, you feel a little sleepy, and you just got like this warm glow. And then it kind of fades away and you feel fine. You're a little hungry and you go have a nap. Like it seems perfect. Do you know what I mean? When you start shooting cocaine, holy fuck, man, that shit grabs you by the back of the hair, makes you bite a curb and stomps on the back of your head. Like the intensity of cocaine addiction compared to the intensity of heroin addiction is like night and day. I'm grateful for the fact that I ended up doing more cocaine because I probably could have went on being a heroin addict for the next 30 years of my life because it's far more manageable. Cocaine is not manageable, especially when you're shooting it. So anyways, I won't get into too many details, but literally from that point, the wheels come off. Within 6 months, I've moved out of my house at 15 years old. I quit school. I'm working at a deli in a grocery store. I'm stealing money from the till every night. I'm shoplifting every second or third night. I'm living with like a fairly significant local drug dealer. And my whole life revolves around getting and staying high. And I am literally just like a piece of shit junkie kid. In my head, I'm living some grand adventure and I'm doing all these things and I matter. And in hindsight, I just wasted my fucking life. Like it was just, yeah, nothing mattered. I didn't care about anybody. There were no kind of limits to what I was willing to do. You know, something I want to touch on is that, you know, one of the reasons that I'm able to be relatively judgment free with people these days is that I know exactly what I'm capable of. I think a lot of people are under an illusion about what behaviors they would do in different circumstances. They're like, oh, I would never be able to do that. And I'm not the type of person that would do that. I have none of those illusions. I am the person that will do that. And I am the type of person I will rob, I will cheat, I will steal, I will fuck you over. Like when I'm in that place and I don't care about anybody but myself, there are no limits to what I'm willing to do. I am an A1 piece of shit. Now, one may ask, well, then how do you wake up every morning and feel good about yourself? Because I'm not a good person because I have to be a good person. I'm a good person because I choose to be a good person. It's like that Jordan Peterson quote that I'm gonna butcher. It's like, you don't want a weak man who is incapable of violence. You want a violent man who chooses not to be violent. That is who I am today. I know the violence I am capable of and what I can do when I am in that place. And so every day that I'm not that person is a win. And it's like, and I choose to not be that person every day. It's one of the, you know, we could have a very deep conversation about like the morals and ethics of religion and all the rest of it. And it's like, what is more noble, to behave appropriately because you're afraid of going to hell, or to behave appropriately because you believe it's the right thing to do? I think there's more nobility in the latter, because the former assumes there's no choice. It's like you're doing it to avoid a punishment. You are only behaving so you don't get punished. That's a childlike behavior. The adult behavior is to have both options on the table and be more than physically capable of both options. But then because of your own choice and your own free will, choosing not to be violent and choosing to be loving and kind and supportive. And I used to think, earlier on in my late 30s and early 40s, I still thought I was a really selfish person. And the more I look at my life today and what I do for people on a regular basis and how I treat the people around me and how I care about people, I can see that I could not feel better about who I am today. And I feel very confident about the amount of time and energy and resources that I put into other people and put before myself on a regular basis, both my close family and my close, circle of friends and even people who aren't close. Like when people reach out and they need help, I'm the type of person that gives it. So anyways, back to our story. So literally the next couple of years, complete write-off. At that point, my mother decides to move to Winnipeg, and she basically has this like coming to Jesus conversation with me. And she's like, I think you need to come to Winnipeg. She's like, you're going to fucking die. I was doing a lot of hard drugs, stealing on a regular basis. I'd already been arrested a couple times, already been to jail a couple times, like holding cells and stuff. I hadn't served any terms at this point. I had only been arrested and charged with a couple various crimes. And I'm not even 18 yet. Like shit is dark. You know what I'm saying? And I kind of had one, like whatever you want to call it, a moment of weakness, a moment of strength, a moment of clarity. And I'm like, I need to get the fuck out of here, man. I can't. This is not how I want to live the rest of my life. Like because of some of these earlier moments, I knew that there was more, right? So I'm like, okay, let's go to Winnipeg. So we go to Winnipeg and I make it like, I don't even know, man, 6 months to a year, living with my mom. And then I just find my people, man. And if anybody's listening to this who's like a hardcore drug addict or a hardcore alcoholic, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have the ability to surround yourself with people that facilitate the lifestyle you want to live. So they don't call you out on your shit because they're doing the same shit. They just make it happen. And it's like you are a black hole with a gravity well that will suck in anything and anyone that gets you what you need. So at this point, maybe I'm like 18 and drop out of school again. And that's it. I never finished my grade 12. I actually have 2 degrees, including a postgraduate degree, and I never finished my grade 12. So I leave school again, get another job. And at this point, I'm living like the core of Winnipeg, like the shitty part of Winnipeg. And I'm living in this fourplex with all these other dudes. I'm selling dope to gang members. Shit's like, I'm working for bikers. Like it's like pretty rough and rowdy times. And I'm not going to like oversell it and say I was like some Billy Badass or anything, but like shit was pretty gnarly, man. And I hung out with some pretty heavy dudes. And so this goes on literally for like the next couple years and I'm just a mess, but I'm like, I'm smart enough, I'm resourceful enough, and I'm driven enough that I'm like just able to keep things together, but have no illusions. I am a full-time drug addict and everything in my life centers around getting and staying high. So then, things start to take another turn. So at this point, I hook up with these dudes. I start running dope from like Winnipeg to other places. We used to run it north. We used to run it east. Work for these bikers with this big grow circle. Like, and you got to remember, this is like pre 9/11. This was like when, like, man, I can remember weed being like $3,600 a pound. People don't even understand like how much weed was and how valuable it was. So we're running dope all over the place. I'm starting to make some legit coin, which only makes the addiction even worse. I'm meeting like heavier dudes. Shit's getting more intense. Anyways, And there's a bunch of other stuff, but I'm going to kind of like gloss all over it because there's like stories galore and all this, and I could do 50 podcasts. Like, you seen that one guy who's, I forget his name, the Connect Pod, and he like went and served some time, and now he just does a podcast about being in jail and being a drug dealer. I could start a whole other podcast just about being a junkie, and I could just tell junkie stories like for an hour a day nonstop. We'll glaze over all that. Let's get to like some of the like the turning points or the moments of crystallization. Now I'm like, I want to say 21 years old, and I come back to Winnipeg on a run. So this is what I used to do. I move a bunch of dope out, get a bunch of cash, come back to Winnipeg, normally wind up at Winnipeg at like midnight, party my face off till like 6 o'clock in the morning, go re-up, and then like head back to whatever podunk town it was I was running dope to. And so I come back, I'm on one of my benders, I pick up this chick who I was like kind of dating at the time. And the last thing I remember, I'd been up for days at this point. And the last thing I remember is we are waiting in a car, and we were in the Osborne Village in Winnipeg for any, like Peg City Holla, for any of my Peg City folk. We're, you know, a couple blocks from the village, and I'm waiting for some blow. And that's the last thing I remember. And then all of a sudden, I wake up, I feel this woman's hand on the back of my neck, and I can hear this girl saying, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay." And I'm thinking to myself, does that mean we have the blow? Like, is it going to be okay? And then I look down and I'm covered in blood. The airbags have gone off in the car. There's smashed glass everywhere. I can see bouncing blue and red lights off of every reflective substance in the car. And I look up and I can see firemen cutting through the roof of the car with the jaws of life. And I just remember thinking to myself, oh, I fucked up. And what happened was, they explained it to me later when I got to the hospital. Apparently when I was waiting for the blow, we'd both passed out. The chick had woke up because she was cold, and she said, we got to go, we got to go, we got to go. And I entered into what they called a hypnagogic state. Not hypnotic, hypnagogic. So technically my brain was asleep, but my body was capable of, because I'd been up for so many days, my body was capable of like routine behavior. So no recollection of any of this. I start the car, I drive through town, I'm going down Pembina Highway. For anybody who lives in Winnipeg, there's these like big steel girders, like these hydro posts on Pembina Highway. And I guess I was going about 100, 120 down Pembina, and flipped into the Meridian, rolled the car, smashed into one of these, and completely rode off the car, sent us both to the hospital. So after looking up and seeing the jaws of life, the next thing I remember is I open my eyes, I'm in a hospital bed, and there's a team of doctors standing around me in a circle, and they're debating whether or not they need to saw open my chest because they believe I may have cracked my sternum. And I just start chuckling because I'm like, this is the craziest shit ever. And I'm so out of it, I don't even really think about it. And then boom, pass back out. Side note, they did not need to. I had a slight fracture in my chest, but they didn't cut me open, and it eventually healed on its own. Next thing, 2 cops come walking in. Now, underneath the passenger seat in the car, there's a Tupperware dish with about an ounce of weed, some dirty Coke spoons and filters, and like a half a dozen syringes. And they walk in and they're like, they tell me what they found, and they're like, we want you to own up to it. And I look at them and I'm like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, man. And the thing was, it was underneath the passenger seat. And there's something I should tell you about this chick I was with. Her old man was a pretty heavy ex-biker. And Winnipeg is not a large place. And so these cops knew who this girl was, and they knew who the old man was. And the cops looked at me and they said, no problem, Jay. It was underneath the passenger seat. We're going to assume that it belonged to the girl. And the car didn't belong to any of us. It was a loaner that I just borrowed from somebody. I gave somebody an ounce of weed to take their car for a couple of days. And so there was no way to take the drugs back to the owner. It had to be somebody in the vehicle, because she was in the passenger seat. It was under the passenger seat. They said, no problem, man. We're just going to charge the girl. And they knew instantly I couldn't let that happen, because A, if that dude found out that I had been shooting blow with his daughter, he would have killed me like no questions asked. And number two, if I allowed his daughter to get charged with a crime that she didn't commit, or even did commit for that matter, he would kill me again. And so I just looked up at them. I said, today's your lucky day, boys. Where do I sign? So it wasn't a big beef, but remember, I had a couple other beefs as like before I turned an adult. So this was my first beef as an adult. So essentially, I took that, and then you think like that would be some type of turning point, or that would be enough that it's like, okay, you need to get your life together. Not even close. So I just ramp off the deep end. I still had all the cash left. I end up getting into a shitload of debt. I go on like a months-long bender. People don't know where I am. I'm losing weight. Like it goes bad. And then, one day I hadn't talked to my mom in months. She was like, you don't exist to me. You got to stop. I can't be around you anymore. It's too much. And so, finally I show back up at her place, and I'm fucked. I got like blood on my face. My arms are all torn up from track marks. I'm a mess. People are looking for me for money. I'm paranoid. It's bad. Like Requiem for a Dream type shit. Bad. And I break down, I'm like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Foreshadowing, I was not done. This is like a brief pause well before the doneness. She lets me stay at her place for a couple days. We do some research. We find a rehab. I check myself into a 30-day rehab. Here's how serious I was. Day 14 of the rehab, and every time we left the rehab, you'd have to have a piss test when you came back. And they would measure the level of substances, because you're still going to piss hot because you were doing dope like 2-3 weeks ago. But what they would do is they could see if the levels had gone down or gone up. So the idea was, as long as you pissed and your levels hadn't gone up, you would get a pass and you could come back into the building. So I literally piss into a cup, go out, score a bunch of rock, smoke a bunch of rock, come back, still high as a kite. They take me to the bathroom and tell me to piss in a cup. And I got a guy standing 2 feet behind me. And I'm literally in my jacket with my dick in one hand, this other cup and the fucking vial in the other hand. And I'm like pouring this piss while I piss into the urinal. So it sounds like and I got away with it. And my brain was so addled at this point that like, I don't take that as a sign that I have a problem. I take that as a sign that I'm a fucking genius. Like I'm literally strutting back to my room like, fuck yeah, bro. You got this shit dialed. Did that like 3 more times during my stay there. Obviously, don't get sober. Get out of rehab, go on another bender. Finally, I hit another bottom of sorts. And basically, I have this cousin who's more like an uncle who lives in London, Ontario. He's a recovered junkie. And basically, we reached out to him, and I was like, I got to get out of Winnipeg, man. So the idea is I'm going to go get sober. So pack up all my shit, move to London, Ontario, take a job as a gas fitter, and start to kind of try and get sober. Like I spent the next 9 months essentially like going to meetings and sometimes using in the bathroom at the meetings. Like it was that fucked up. Like I'd get a 30-day chip and then I'd go back out and then I wouldn't tell anybody and I'd take a 60-day chip and then I'd admit to a relapse and I'd take another 30-day. Like I was just a revolving door. And essentially after 9 months, I just crashed myself again. And earlier when I alluded to the intensity of cocaine addiction, like this is what happens. Like I've done a lot of drinking. I've done a lot of heroin. I've done a lot of like acid and other like bendery type drugs. Nothing crushes your soul like shooting cocaine for multiple days on end. And once you go through like a couple of months of that, your constitution is just like, you're just willing to do whatever it takes to get the pain to stop because you just can't handle it anymore. And like, that's the part I'm grateful for. Flash forward when I finally did get a year of recovery, you get these like chips and you can get engraved on the back, whatever you want. And I had Keeping the Moment Alive engraved on the back of mine. And somebody said, oh, is that to remember how happy you were when you were a year sober? And I said, no, that's to remember how much pain I was in when I couldn't get sober. Because the moment that I forget how painful it was, I will repeat it. So during this time that I'm living in London, my grandmother comes to town for open heart surgery because like London, Ontario is known for a couple of really big hospitals. And I think she was in St. Joe's. And so she was going in at like 8 o'clock in the morning. And I kind of had my stuff together a little at this point, was still staying at my cousin's, hadn't got my own place yet. And she was supposed to be out by 4 or 5. And it was 8 o'clock at night and we still hadn't heard anything. And my cousin and my aunt were there. So my cousin I'm living with, he says to me, listen, let's go get some Timmies. We'll take him to the hospital. The girls are probably pretty distraught by this point. We hadn't received any news. So we go to Timmy's, and I can remember going to St. Joe's. We got in the elevator. We go up to the 5th floor. We get off at the ICU. And as soon as we get off, my aunt and my cousin are standing there crying. And they grab the Tim Hortons and they set it down on like this little bench. And they're like, come with us. So we walk in the ICU. We take a left. We walk all the way to the end of the hall. And in the last bed on the left-hand side is my grandma. And she's gone. They still have her alive with machines. But she's done. They're basically like just keeping her on life support until we showed up, had a chance to say goodbye, and they unplug the machines and she passes. And like, I don't have the emotional maturity to deal with this appropriately. I'm like, I just watched somebody die. This is crazy. Now, that was like, I think that was a Wednesday. And so the funeral was scheduled for a Saturday. We lived in London, which is like maybe 2-3 hours from Owen Sound. She was originally from Tara, which is like half an hour away. And everybody's coming home, okay? You are talking like hundreds of people. You got 8 kids. You got 50 grandkids. You got great grandkids. You got cousins, nieces, nephews. Like hundreds of people are coming for this thing. My mom is flying from Winnipeg. Everybody's coming back. So Friday night, the day before the funeral, me and my cousin drive up to Tara and we're going to stay the night. And I look back at this night sometimes and I'm like, why didn't you just stay home? You know? And I said to my cousin, hey, I'm going to run into Owen Sound. Can I borrow the van? And I'm going to see some friends. And he's like, yeah, man, no problem. And I instantly knew what I was going to do because I had connections in Owen Sound. Let's go party. So I end up finding an old buddy of mine. We end up drinking a bunch of methadone. That's the other thing. Methadone is like flowing like Coca-Cola at this point because all these like rehab clinics are trying to get people off heroin and they're just giving out methadone like candy. And methadone is shit. It's garbage. There's no rush to it. Like just as a drug, it's shit. But anyways, we drink a bunch of methadone. We drink a bunch of booze. And there's these things called peelers. There's these morphine tabs that you can kind of shoot. They come... You know how like a red Tylenol has that kind of like coating on it? These morphine pills would have the same coating. But if you took your thumbnail, and this is why they're called peelers, if you took your thumbnail and peeled that red coating off, you could take the pill that was left and kind of dissolve it in water and shoot it. It always turned out to be like messier than it should be. You ended up clogging needles and getting them stuck in your arm. And it was not a pleasant process, but if you knew what you were doing, you could shoot these peelers and get like a fairly close to heroin high out of these like prescription drugs. And so we were shooting peelers, drinking methadone, drinking booze. And that's the last thing I remember. At 5 o'clock in the morning, they find me in my buddy's bedroom in convulsions, bloody foam coming out of my nose and mouth. I don't remember any of this. The first thing I remember is I hear, and then this voice, I'm blind, I can't see, I don't know why, could have been something they gave me, could have been a result of the overdose, can't see anything, and this voice kind of from above goes, we're en route to London, Mr. Nichol, and I realize I'm in a helicopter. So what happened was, I had an overdose, they took me to the hospital. My buddy didn't admit all the drugs that we were doing. So they thought I had spinal meningitis. So they're literally like giving me spinal taps. They think I'm dying. Like it's over. And they're like, we need to get him to London immediately. So they put me on a helicopter. They fly me to London. This is where shit gets weird. They then take me to St. Joe's Hospital. They take me to the 5th floor and they put me in the last bed on the left-hand side of the hall. The exact same bed that my grandmother had died in 3 days before. And this was the type of shit that I'm capable of doing to the people that I love. So my cousin, who had to go watch my grandmother die in this bed 3-4 days before, now had to come see me in a coma in this bed for like a week. So basically, after waking up in the helicopter, boom, I'm done. I'm in a coma. And I think part of it was drug induced because they didn't know what was going on with me. Long story short, what happened was I was working as a gas fitter at the time. Turned out I had pneumonia. I had worked for a week with pneumonia. Then when I did all these downers, it basically like my lungs just couldn't keep up with the fluid anymore. So the overdose paired with the pneumonia, I just had this complete respiratory collapse. Go into a coma. I'm in a coma for a week in the same fucking bed my grandmother died in. So they're telling my mother comes to the hospital. So this is another example of what I'm capable of doing to the people I love. My mother has to fly from Winnipeg to put her mother in the ground. She then has to get in a car and drive 3 hours and look at her oldest son, who's tried to sober up like 6 times now, in a hospital bed, in a coma. Full respiratory, like the thing breathing for you, the machine's beeping, the whole 9 yards. So a week later, I finally wake up and they've been telling my mother, listen, he is likely going to die. If he doesn't die, he is for sure going to have brain damage. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. His brain was without oxygen for too long. He's been in the coma for too long. It's not good. So just be prepared for who he is when he comes back. And then I hadn't been getting along with my father for the last few years because he had no patience for like the drug addiction shit. And he was just like, fuck you, get your shit together, fuck off. And I don't blame the guy. But when I finally woke up, my mother had to fly back to Winnipeg. And she said, I got to fly back to Winnipeg. And I started freaking out. I can't talk to them because I have a tube in my throat. And I'm making these like gestures, like these pen gestures with my hand. And my cousin, they're trying to kick them out of the room, but my cousin, who's this big ex-biker, says, get the boy a pen. So they got him a pen, and I was trying to write more, but all I was able to write, because they said, your father is coming because your mother has to leave and somebody's got to be here with you. And I was pissed. I didn't want him there. And I was trying to write, he's only coming to appease his own conscience. But I could only get out as much as he's only coming to appease. And it was too much. I was getting too tired. And the doctor said, that's enough. Take the paper, take the pen, kick everybody out. They go out into the hall and my cousin takes the paper and hands it to my mom. And my mom starts crying. And she looks at my cousin and she says, a boy with fucking brain damage doesn't use the word appease. And so somehow, you know what I'm saying? Make it through all that. I guarantee I am short some brain cells from the shit I've done, but I am not a complete, moron. I was able to like basically hold it together. So I'm in the hospital for another week. I have to go through respiratory rehab. I have to go through physical rehab. I have to go through a whole bunch of shit. Get out of hospital. Now you would think, right? Like a normal human being, after experiencing this level of challenge and absurdity, would be like, bro, it's enough. Nah, not me. This is why when people ask, like, how do you do what you do and how do you stay out there for so long? And like, the shit I do today ain't nothing to the shit that I used to do back then. Like, I have never, not quitting was a problem for me. It was not a benefit. It was not something that brought good into my life. It was something that brought bad. Like, every characteristic has a flip side to it. It's like a tool. It's a hammer. You can build a house with it or you can smoke somebody across the temple with it. It's up to you how you use those characteristics. So anyways, I get out of the hospital and I just keep going hard. I go for like another 3-4 months, finally bury myself in another bender, finally like break even more psychologically and emotionally and have another breakdown, and was able to check myself into a detox, like a full blown rummy, bed bug, lice, homeless dude, bottom of the barrel detox. And it's at this point that I'm looking around and I'm like, this is my life. This like young kid who was bright, who used to be a straight A student, who was well-spoken, is a piece of shit junkie who cannot stop abusing himself and the people around. Like, that's what I was talking about earlier. Like, I don't have any illusions. Like, that is who I am. That person is in me. I am capable of that just as much today as I was back then. And this is when it finally starts to shift. Okay. So while I'm in detox, I'm able to find this treatment center. And I knew, I'm like, my brain is fucked. And I'm still smarter than the average bear at this point. So the problem is, every time I get a little bit better, I talk myself and the people around me into like letting me go do shit that's going to let me get high. And I knew I had to go get locked up. I'm like, somebody has to stick me in some room for 6 months and brainwash me. Like, I'm fucked. I don't trust myself. And so I found a Salvation Army treatment center called Hope Acres. It was about 45 minutes outside of Barrie, Ontario. It was on 120 acres. And it was basically one of these working treatment centers that had like a wood shop and a bunch of other stuff. And there was some kind of Christian overtones, but it was basically a 12-step recovery program. And so I checked myself in. They were able to find room for me. I get to this place and I can remember in the intake interview, there's like this old Christian lady, Yvonne, with like these big ass glasses and huge hair and like nice enough lady, kind of scary, and I said to her, I'm like, you need to not believe anything I tell you for the next 6 months, because I'm going to tell you whatever you need to hear for you to let me out of here. And I can't leave. So the first thing she started me with was a 30-day lockdown. I literally could not leave the property for 30 days. And life, I'm not going to get into a ton of detail, but it's like, if you've been to a treatment center, it's a treatment center. You got like daily meetings, you got daily counseling. The difference here was all that shit happened before noon, then you'd have lunch, then you'd go work for the afternoon. And I ended up working in the wood shop refinishing furniture. And I think that's a great way to do recovery. Like, you can't do that recovery bullshit 24 hours a day. And I think having too much time on your hands is not a good thing. You need to feel productive. So I basically sit in this place for 6 months, right? And I won't get into all the stories, but I have these like moments of clarity. I have these amazing epiphanies. I have these like life-changing moments, and I work on myself and I do recovery and I go to group and I make friends, I lose friends. And it turns out I have a cousin who lives in Barrie who has a young family, and she has a basement kind of suite in her house. So I used to go visit her on weekends because I'd get like little passes once I kind of got my shit together. And basically she's like, listen, when you get out, come live here. I'll charge you X amount a month, cover your food, room, boarding, whole 9 yards. And it'll be good for you because you'll be around family. And to this day, I owe her a debt that I will never be able to repay. Because when I got out of that place, I lived with them for a year. And every single other person that I was in that treatment center with has gone back out. And I didn't, at least that we'll get into. The story's not over, my friends. But at that point, I don't go out. And a lot of credit for that is because I was with a family. I was coming home every day to 5- and 6-year-old children that loved me, that looked up to me, that wanted hugs, that wanted me to read to them at night. My cousin was there. Her husband was there. They were like real people. They cared about me. And I didn't care so much about disappointing myself, but I didn't want to disappoint them. And I was able to get that first year under my belt. So during this time, a whole bunch of crazy stuff happens. I decide, I go to EI, and they're like, clearly in order to be satisfied in any type of career, you need more education. So I'm like, I want to go to university. And they're like, well, if you go to university, you can apply as a mature student. So I apply to a bunch of universities, and holy shit, one of them like lets me in. And that's the funny thing about university. They give you this song and dance that you got to take all these classes and do everything right. When you're a mature student, you can basically go to any university you want because the statistics of you graduating are so high because you're an adult paying your own way that they'll let almost anybody in. So I get accepted to Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. I decide to major in psychology, which is like, I don't even know why. And I end up living in Barrie for another year. I end up taking these computer courses. I end up being the computer administrator for the computer system at the New VR, which is like a television network that's associated with City TV. And at the end of that year, I'm literally sitting on the fence, and my boss is like, you could run the entire computer system within a couple of years at this TV network, or you can leave and go be a broke university student. And I'm like, I don't know why I got to do this, man, but I got to leave because I felt like I had to build something for myself. And I had this chip on my shoulder, this like inferiority complex. Like I hated being around people who were smarter than I was. And I knew I needed to go to university. And this was a false belief, but I was under the assumption that I needed to go to university and educate myself so that I wouldn't feel inferior. And here's the short version. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. If you feel inferior, you're always going to feel inferior. And no amount of like money, education, pride, accolades is going to change that. It's not until you feel good about yourself as a human being and you feel like you're worthwhile and a value to society that shit goes away. And that took years for me to get. So anyways, I quit that job. I moved to Thunder Bay. I start going to university and stuff goes crazy. I somehow get elected as the guy to build a radio station. So over 3 years at Thunder Bay, they went from 0 radio station to fully online to a fully CRTC licensed 24/7 FM station, fully funded by the student population. I built that whole thing, ended up being a nude model for arts classes for 2 years to make money on the side, ended up getting my snowboarding certification and taught snowboarding every winter. And, I ended up taking calculus and physics in year 1, a high school dropout, ended up with a 99% in calculus, a 94% in physics. Like I went fucking off. I had this, and that's another part of why this story is important if you want to understand who I am. I have this chip on my shoulder because of how much of my life I wasted that like I will kill myself if that's what's required to achieve the goals that I've set out for myself because I have no patience or tolerance. There's no excuse that I can make that is any greater than the shit that I've already done and the time that I've already wasted. So like I had this like fury and vengeance for life that it was like I wanted to crush everything. Like if it was out there, I'm doing it. If I'm gonna try, I'm gonna excel. If there's people doing it, I'm gonna fucking crush them. Like it didn't matter. And so I go through university like this, and probably the most important thing that happened to me is that I ended up tree planting my first summer. So I was in Winnipeg, I was at this house party, I was like a year and a half, maybe 2 years, maybe coming up on 2 years sober. And this guy goes to me, you know, what are you gonna do for your summer break? And I'm like, I don't know, man. I said, I want to travel, I want to be outside, and I want to make a shitload of money. And he goes, you need to go tree planting. And I'm like, what's tree planting? He starts pulling up these websites, and it's like, holy shit, man. You can go live in the tent for 3-4 months, get paid per tree, and if you crush it, you can make a shitload of money. So I end up getting a job in Northern Ontario, go tree planting. And at that point, it was the first thing in my life that I'd ever been the best at. The second last day of the season, I ended up planting 7,038 trees in 11 hours and 55 minutes and setting a new company record my rookie year. I made $600 that day. And I realized that when I was passionate about something, no one could fuck with me. Like it was like I had this whole other gear that like just didn't exist for other people. And it came from all this shit, man. Like it was fuel, and it just enabled me to like just kick into this other level and just go completely ridiculous. And so I killed myself that summer. I ended up making like 20 grand, take all of August off. And then that was it for me, man. I just wanted to plant every summer. And I started planting out west because you could make way more money, and started doing heli shows and flying all over the place. I was a highballer, and then I started running crews, and then it just took me all over the place. End up getting an offer, finish university, move out west, plant in the summers, teach snowboarding, and live on Mount Washington on the island in the winter, having a great life, planting trees in the fall. So I'm 4 years sober at this point. We're planting trees in the fall, and we find a crop of weed. And I'd stopped going to meetings probably a year and a half before this. And we find this crop of weed. And I'm around nobody I've ever known before. They're like some planting buddies, but like the people who know me now have no idea, kind of, you know, it's an interesting way to say this. They have no idea who I really am. They have no idea where I came from. They have no idea who I used to be. So I feel free to just kind of reinvent myself. And we find this crop of weed. We all snap off a couple buds. I take it back to the hotel and end up drying it out that night. And the next night I smoked some weed. And after 4.5 years of sobriety, I went back out, and within 6 months, I was a fucking junkie. I swear to God. Like, people ask me today, I'm almost 15 years sober now again, and we'll get to that part. They'll ask me today, like, could you smoke a joint? Could you have a glass of wine? And I'm like, maybe. I mean, I feel like I could. I don't feel like it would like set off some chain reaction that would nuke my entire life. But here's what I do know. When I was 4.5 years sober, I smoked one joint and I almost lost my entire life within 6 months. And so if that's on the table as a potential outcome, I ain't rolling those fucking dice. So anyways, within 6 months, I become I'm selling ecstasy again on the island. We're doing so much fucking E, it's out of control. We're smoking rock. Kind of stayed off the needle for a while because I was just so fucking scared of needle drugs because I knew where that would take me. But I'm smoking rock, I'm snorting blow, I'm doing tons of pills, like going off. But it's also, I don't know if it's Vancouver Island, man. And this like drug addiction is kind of like a way of life. I don't mean to like shit on anybody's parade, but like, when you're in your 20s and a tree planter on Vancouver Island, you can have a pretty fucked up lifestyle and you don't really look that out of place. So that went on for a really long time. And then I ended up getting a job offer and moved to Australia to run crews of tree planters. And I lived over there for 2 years and just basically partied constantly. And I can remember saying to one of my planters, we party like rock stars. And he's like, no, we don't. We party like fucking drug addicts. And basically 2 straight years over there is a blur. The only way I could keep it together is because of how hard we worked. So we would disappear on these contracts. We would go into the bush. We would plant these big plantations or reforested areas or whatever. And for like 2, 3, 4 weeks, it would be like solid work 6, 7 days a week, make a ton of cash. And then we'd all head back to Byron and you would go insane for a week. Blow all your cash, do a bunch of drugs. And drugs in Australia are insanely expensive. Like Coke's $300 a gram, E's $40 a pill. Like it almost keeps you under control because it's like you can't nuke your life that much. It's just way too expensive. And it's because it's an island and the Coast Guard is really effective at keeping drugs out of Australia. Anyways, I end up doing a bunch of meth over there. And I quit my job. I go get this other job. I'm a walking disaster. But again, my drive, my intelligence, my ingenuity, I'm able to like just keep things together with like bubble gum and duct tape. So after 2 years, my 2 working visas run out and I come home. I get a job with my mom's company. I help move it out to British Columbia. And I know right away it's not what I'm built for. So at this point, I start looking around for jobs and I see this job for a forestry engineer. I'd never heard of a forestry engineer in my life. Didn't even know what it was. Been in cut blocks for the last 10 years and never once thought to myself, how does this cut block get here? What about the rivers? What about the creeks? How do these roads get designed? What harvesting systems did they use? What ecological and environmental concerns had to be avoided? Like there are a million questions that all need to be answered before you decide what patch of timber you're allowed to take. What is the financial value of this timber? How far are we hauling it? Where is it going? What's it being sold for?
And it turns out a forestry engineer is a guy who answers all of those questions. So I basically bullshit my way into this job as an assistant forestry engineer. You normally need a forestry tech certificate in order to get it, but I talked my way around it because of all my planting experience. And then like engineering is the next 10 years of my life after all that planting. And I fell in love with it as a career and I was great at it, but I was still a fucking junkie. So at this time, I'm living in Nanaimo and I'm working in Holberg on the north end of the island. And I'm working 10s and 4s. For people who don't know, that means you go in for 10 days, you come out for 4. So it's a 2-week rotation. And that was enough to keep my life just together. You know what I'm saying? Like, because I was only home for 4 days, I could only destroy so much. But literally, I'd come back to my condo that I bought in Nanaimo and I would just stay there and I would basically just do blow. And I was still smoking rock, kind of stayed off the needle again because I couldn't handle the intensity of it all. I'd smoke rock for 4 days, blow my whole paycheck, and I'd pour myself into my truck, drive 5 hours up island and go back to work in the woods and just smoke weed and drink all week, recover, feel better, go back to Nanaimo, rinse and repeat. Do that for a long time. And then 2008 hits, market crash, housing crash, forestry crash. Forestry basically shuts down on the island. I start reaching out everywhere. I'm able to find myself a job in Quesnel. Now I'm glossing over a whole bunch of stuff here, but there's, maybe I'll tell some more stories later on, or if you guys got some questions, you can always, hit me up. But I'm just trying to, I don't want to glorify the drug addiction too much. And I don't want to belabor the point. Like, listen, I was a piece of shit and I was barely holding my life together is essentially what went on. So when I went back out at 4.5 years sober, I was then out for another 3.5. I went back using for 3.5 years. And then right near the end of that, I found myself in Quesnel. And that's when everything fell apart again because there was no more 10s and 4s. So I could go to the bar every night. I could find blow every night. I could not sleep and go to work the next day. And literally within a month, I was an inch away from losing my job. I was an inch away from missing mortgage payments, losing my truck. Like everything was imploding. And it all comes down to one night. It was like a Friday night. I go to the bar. And again, remember how we were talking about that black hole with gravity and like sucking people in? I meet this chick, not particularly attractive, if I'm going to be honest with you. And she had some blow. I had some blow. You know, as soon as you meet, like why you're at the bar, right? And she's like, do you have someplace we can go? I'm like, yeah. So we go back to my place. We end up doing blow all night. We end up re-upping like 3-4 times. I finally get rid of this chick at like 6-7 in the morning when I drop her off. And I'm just like, and I'm feeling like I have that like soul level paranoia and like anxiety that if you've never been on a multi-day coke bender, like you don't know what I'm talking about, but you feel like the world is about to implode on you and there's cops everywhere. And there's like, you feel like a tiny scared cat in a room full of mouse traps and you're going to get your tail chopped off. Like everything scares you. And this is a theme I almost want to spend some time on. Like I hated feeling afraid. It made me feel weak and it made me feel small. And so I decided I'm going to go to work by myself at, 7 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And at this point, I'm hallucinating voices and shit. Like I've been up for so long and I've been doing so many drugs, like my brain is just completely checked out. And so I go to the woods, I kind of fucking, do some stuff for a day, but I'm like, I'm hearing voices, I'm seeing things, I'm wasting time. Like I'm not doing anything effective. And all I can think about is like more blow, more blow, more blow. And I'm like, I think there's some maybe back at the house. I think there's some maybe back at the house. And so I knock off at like 3 o'clock or something. I get back to the house. I'm looking all around the house. I find this, like, I don't know, it's probably fucking drywall dust or something on the dryer. End up trying to smoke that. And then like everything comes crashing down, right? And I literally hear this voice inside my head. Now, the whole 3.5 years that I've been out, it never once occurred to me that I should go back to meetings. Like, it wasn't like I thought to myself, man, if I go to AA or NA, I bet you that would get me sober. Fuck it, maybe tomorrow. Like, it never even entered my head as an option. And then out of nowhere, this voice, like crystal clear inside my head, says, if you don't go to a meeting tonight, you may never go to another one for the rest of your life. And I just, like, everything fucking stopped. And I was like, he's right. I picked up the phone book, literally found the 1-800 number for AA. There's a voicemail machine. I left my voice. I left my message. I'm like, hey, this is Jay. I need to find a meeting. I don't know what's going on. And this guy named Ernie phones me back like 10 minutes later. He's like, hey, Jay, what's going on? I'm like, not much, man. I'm like, you know, there's any meetings tonight? And he goes, yeah. And he gives me the address, and it was down at the hospital. I think it was 8 o'clock at night. And he goes, do you need somebody to come pick you up? And I'm like, no, I'm good, man. I just need to get back to a meeting. And he's like, oh, you done this before? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, okay, you just need a recharge, man. And I hung up the phone and I just broke down crying, literally. I phoned my brother and I said, I need you to phone me back. It was like an hour or two before the meeting. I'm like, I need you to phone me back in an hour or two and make sure I go to this meeting. Because if I don't go to this meeting, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to get this shit together. Funny thing is, my brother actually never phoned me back. And I still kind of bust his balls about it today. I was like, there was really no other more important phone call, but he was dealing with his own shit. But it was more the symbolic gesture that I was like, I needed somebody else to know where I was at and what I was doing. And I made it to the meeting. That was August 23rd, 2008. I have not touched a mind-altering substance since that day. So this August will be 15 years clean and sober from everything, booze, drugs, you name it. And so, like, how did I do that? What happened? I think part of it is a gift. I'm not going to get all woo-woo higher power on you all, because I know that's like for some people and not for some others. But I have seen too many people work too hard and fail to think that it was all my discipline and will. And I've seen too many people kind of half-ass it and get better to not believe that there's something else kind of going on. And at the end of the day, I don't care. I got a second opportunity. And as soon as I saw that's what it was, like, that desire, the obsession and the compulsion was lifted on that day. And it's never returned like it was there before, ever. I've never felt that need like I did for 30 years of my life before that. So it was 30 years when I sobered up a month before my 30th birthday. So I'll be 45 this year, and I sobered up when I was 30. So I literally spent, a third of my life, almost 2/3 of my life, half of my life, because 15 to 30 is almost, anyways, a large percentage of my life. That obsession and compulsion is what drove every waking moment of my life. And that's the other reason why, some people look and it's like, maybe from the outside, they think I have stuff easy or whatever it may be, or I spend a lot of money on gear. They think, and I don't really care what people think, but the amount of drive and ambition and need that I have to make up for that time. And so I kill myself to get what it is that I think is what I'm supposed to be doing and how I'm supposed to be behaving and the things I should be doing for my family. That's my secret power. Do you know what I mean? Nothing can, compared to that, nothing is hard. Nothing is challenging. Nothing scares me. Nothing makes me feel bad. Everything is muted. It's like somebody took the volume level and turned it down to 2. This is another reason why I have to do these backcountry hunts and I do these insane solo trips. I think my dopamine and serotonin levels are all fucked up from the drugs. And if I don't do crazy shit, it doesn't even register, chemically in my body as an experience. It's just it's boring. So anyways, what happens from that point? So I start going back to meetings and I meet this guy named Rick. I'd kind of had sponsors before and I'd kind of done steps before, but when I met Rick, it was different. Rick was an ex-junkie. Rick had over 20 years of sobriety, and Rick was a was a hard son of a bitch. Like he was, some people didn't like him. He was rough around the edges, but for a year when I lived in Quesnel, I went to his house every Sunday morning, and his wife Trudy would make us coffee, and then she'd leave us alone, and we'd sit in his little kitchen nook and we would work the steps. And I'm not going to do a big speech for AA because it's attraction rather than promotion. And it's like, it really pisses me off when people on social media start going on and on about their recovery. Like, that's not how it's supposed to work. You are not supposed to get on a soapbox and like, look at how great I am because I got sober. That's not how it works. What I will say is that when you choose to dedicate yourself 100% and choose to do whatever you're told, regardless of how afraid you are, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes you, like that's where I turned up a lot of that shit that happened when I was a kid. Same type of shit happened to him. He knew what it was like. We broke down a couple times together. We worked through that shit together. Like all those memories started coming back, and we did all these exercises. I was doing writings every week. Like it was everything for me for a year. And I worked through my 12 steps, and we did that together. And I ended up leaving Quesnel after that year. Still talk to Rick every now and then. And I came down to Vancouver. And so I got to Vancouver 15 years ago. And everything that I have today, like I had nothing, like I'm barely holding on to my condo, barely holding on to my truck, nothing but like credit card debt. I had nothing when I was 30 years old. And there's no point in like listing my accomplishments and what I own and shit, because it's arrogant and egotistical. But everything, I am happy, I am safe, I am sound, my family's taken care of. I live a life today that I couldn't even have imagined, I've got 6 hunting trips and over 75 field days planned this year. And that doesn't even count any scouting or anything. I've been able to build multiple businesses. I have a beautiful daughter. I have Mindful Hunter. I have Mindful Reviews. Like Mindful Reviews, people start to ask me like, what's the thing you're most proud of in your life? And like, I'm going to be honest with you, man, Mindful Reviews is starting to climb to the top. Like that's one of those things that like, when you want to talk about not competing and creating your own category, like I just made it up in my head. I was like, there's a problem. People are getting fucked over because of these shitty influencers. There's got to be a better way to do this. And I had nothing more than an idea and some discipline and some people who believed in me. But everything that has come into my life since then is because I got sober. Now, I'm not saying you need to be sober, but everyone has their arc, right? Like, what's your story? What's your shit you're getting over? What's your challenge? Like, we are relative beings, which means we judge things through relativity. I can only tell you how hard something is by relating it to something else that was either more or less difficult. I have been extremely fortunate in that the shit that I went through in my life was like 10 out of 10 difficulty. So now all the stuff that I run into, whether it's problems in my relationships, financial problems, problems with my career, it's like it's not that bad because I can relate it back to all this other shit. So what are those things for you? And if you don't have those things yet, what's stopping you from going and getting them? Like, go do a backcountry trip, go climb a mountain, go to a retreat or some type of a yoga retreat, a meditation retreat, like do one of these ayahuasca trips. I don't know, but like do something that scares you and that's harder and more difficult than anything you've ever done. Because ever since I got sober, that was the rule. Like whatever I'm doing now, I need to have stuff on the horizon that's bigger and better. And I'm not going to say that's the right way to live my life because there's just a whole lot of still not being okay. Like the voices in my head don't shut up unless I'm struggling for something. Like when I'm trying to build something, when I'm trying to solve a problem, when I'm at the gym, when I'm in the backcountry, when I'm planning for a trip, like as long as I'm consumed with creating something, my mind is quiet and I feel at peace. But the moment I stop, some of that old shit kind of comes rushing back in. So there's an argument, I suppose, that like a little less ambition and a little less, drive in exchange for a little more peace of mind. But like, maybe that's the next chapter for me. I'm only 40, I'll be 45 in September. Maybe that's what my late 40s and 50s are going to be about, is about me, walking whatever path it is I need to walk in order to, come full circle and finally be at peace with myself and not, I still feel like I have something to prove. I do still feel some days that inferiority complex or that imposter syndrome or that chip on the shoulder. Like, fuck you. You don't think I can, like, I love when people beak off online because it's like, oh, you thought I was doing shit before? That was like level 7. I'm about to kick shit up to level 10. Like, it was so funny. It was at the end of 2022 and there was like this chatter and people were saying stuff. I'm not even going to get into it, but I was like, they ain't seen shit. And like the review schedule I've been able to put together in 2023, I've done more review videos in 2023 than I have in the entire rest of my career. And I'm only getting started. And so it would be a lie to say that I am like peaceful and calm inside. But I'm still young too. So it's like, I don't want that fire to go away just yet. I still have things I need to build and things I want to do. There you go, man. I don't know. Was it helpful? Was it good for me to get it out? I thought maybe I should write some notes before this, but then I was like, that doesn't feel right. I kind of feel like if it's meant to come out, it'll come out. And if I skipped over it, then maybe there's a reason I skipped over it. I hope there was a semi kind of logical flow to that conversation for you. I hope it made sense. I hope you took something away from it. As always, if there's anything else you want to know, I'm an open book. I no longer go to meetings regularly, so I'm not the guy to reach out to, and ask for help specifically. But if you are going through something and you need somebody to talk to, my door is always open. Please feel free, shoot me a DM, email. You want my number? All you got to do is ask. I'm always willing to share my story if it can benefit somebody else. So there it is, man. Thank you very much for your time. And until next time, thanks for tuning in.